Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we celebrate the strength of the human spirit through tales of compassion, resilience, and community. Today's story highlights the incredible power of one person's care to make a difference in someone's life. Join us as we follow James Carter's journey to help his beloved neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, in the quaint town of Willowbrook. Nestled amidst rolling hills and whispering forests, lived a young woman named Emily. Her days were filled with the simple joys of rural life, tending to her family's farm, wandering through the meadows, and losing herself in the pages of romantic novels. Emily's heart brimmed with dreams of love and adventure, yearning for a story that transcended the ordinary. One crisp autumn morning, as the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and rose, Emily set out towards the nearby woods to gather wildflowers. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. As she ventured deeper into the forest, humming a soft tune, she noticed a figure in the distance, crouched by the edge of a clear, bubbling stream. Curiosity piqued. Emily approached cautiously. There, she found a young man, his clothes tattered and eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. He was attempting to cleanse a wound on his arm, the water tinged pink with blood. Without hesitation, Emily knelt beside him. "Let me help you," she offered gently, her voice laced with concern. The stranger looked up, surprise flickering across his face. I don't want to trouble you," he replied, his accent hinting at distant lands. "It's no trouble at all," Emily insisted, retrieving a handkerchief from her basket. "We need to stop the bleeding." As she tended to his wound, the young man introduced himself as Adrian, a traveler who had been ambushed by bandits on the road. His journey had brought him from a far-off country, seeking refuge and a new beginning. Emily listened intently, her heart swelling with empathy for the hardships he had endured. "You can stay with my family until you've recovered," she offered, her eyes meeting his with unwavering kindness. Adrian hesitated, the weight of pride and gratitude battling within him. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you. Your generosity means more than I can express." Together, they made their way back to Willowbrook, the path winding through sun-dappled groves and fields ripe with the season's harvest. Emily's parents welcomed Adrian without reservation, embodying the warmth and hospitality that defined their community. As days turned into weeks, Adrian's strength returned, and he began to assist with the daily chores, his presence becoming a cherished addition to their household. During this time, Emily and Adrian's bond deepened. They spent evenings sharing stories beneath the starlit sky, their conversations flowing with ease and laughter. Emily found herself drawn to Adrian's resilience and gentle spirit, while Adrian admired Emily's compassion and unwavering optimism. One evening, as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, Adrian confided in Emily about his past. He spoke of the turmoil in his homeland, the loss of his family, and the loneliness that had accompanied his journey. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she reached out to hold his hand. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "We are your family now." In that moment, a profound sense of belonging washed over Adrian. The walls he had built around his heart began to crumble, allowing the warmth of love and acceptance to seep in. He realized that amidst the trials of life, he had found a sanctuary in Emily's embrace, a place where he could heal and rediscover the joys of living. As the seasons changed, so did the relationship between Emily and Adrian. Their friendship blossomed into a love that was both tender and fierce, rooted in mutual respect and shared dreams. They envisioned a future together, one where they could build a life filled with love, compassion, and the simple pleasures of Willowbrook. However, life often tests the strength of our hearts, and Emily and Adrian were no exception. As they prepared to face the challenges ahead, they clung to the profound lessons they had learned, that empathy can bridge the deepest divides, that love can heal the most wounded souls, and that together, they could overcome any obstacle that life placed in their path. And so, with hearts entwined and spirits unyielding, Emily and Adrian embarked on the next chapter of their journey, ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that the power of love and empathy would guide them through the darkest of times. The morning air in Brookfield was crisp, with the kind of chill that hinted at the approaching winter. James Carter, still unsettled from his visit to Mrs. Whitaker's house, found himself distracted as he went about his deliveries. The image of the overgrown yard and the overflowing mailbox lingered in his mind, refusing to be dismissed. Mrs. Whitaker had always been a symbol of grace and order, her garden meticulously maintained, her porch spotless, and her warm smile a fixture of his daily routine. That morning, it was as if her home had become a shadow of itself, hollow and abandoned. As James finished his route, he resolved to return. His gut told him that something was wrong, and he couldn't ignore it. The idea of overstepping crossed his mind, but it was quickly overridden by the memory of Mrs. Whitaker's kindness over the years. She had treated him not just as her mailman, but as a friend, always asking about his day and offering a kind word or two. If she needed help now, how could he walk away? When James arrived at her home a second time, he was struck by how forlorn it looked in the afternoon light. The shutters were closed, and the curtains drawn tight, giving the house an air of isolation. He climbed the steps with purpose, but as he raised his hand to knock, he hesitated. What if she was fine? What if he was overreacting? But deep down, he knew better. Something wasn't right. He knocked firmly and waited. The second stretched into a minute, and just as he was about to turn away, he heard the faint shuffle of footsteps from inside. The door creaked open to reveal Mrs. Whitaker, though she was nearly unrecognizable. Her once neatly combed silver hair was matted and greasy, and her usually bright eyes were dull and unfocused. Her frail body swayed slightly, as if she could collapse at any moment. "Mrs. Whitaker," James said gently, his voice laced with concern. "It's me, James, your mailman. Are you all right?" She blinked at him, as though struggling to place his face. "James," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "I'm fine, just a little tired. That's all." But she wasn't fine. Her clothes were wrinkled and stained, and a faint, unpleasant odor lingered in the air. Behind her, James caught a glimpse of the living room. It was in complete disarray, piles of newspapers, empty containers, and even medical supplies scattered across the floor. Dust clung to the furniture, and the curtains blocked out the sunlight, making the space feel oppressive. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, keeping his tone calm, "I don't think you're fine. Can I call someone for you? A family member or a doctor?" Her response was sharp and unexpected. "No," she snapped, a flicker of defiance in her weak frame. "I told you, I'm fine. I don't need anyone poking their nose into my business." James stepped back, startled but not deterred. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "but I'm worried about you. This isn't like you." She began to close the door, but her movements were slow and unsteady. As the door clicked shut, James stood there, conflicted. Respecting her wishes felt wrong when every fiber of his being told him she needed help. He glanced back at the house as he walked down the steps, the sight of its once pristine facade now hauntingly neglected. He knew he couldn't leave things as they were. Sitting in his postal van, James deliberated over what to do. She had explicitly told him to leave her alone. But could he live with himself if something happened to her? The image of her frail figure and the chaotic state of her home replayed in his mind. Finally, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his hands trembling slightly. 911. "What's your emergency?" came the calm voice on the other end. "This is James Carter," he began, his voice shaky but resolute. "I'm a mailman, and I'm really worried about one of the residents on my route. Her name is Mrs. Whitaker, and she lives at 87 Maple Avenue. I've been to her house twice today, and something's very wrong. She doesn't look well, and her home is in bad shape." As he relayed the details, the dispatcher assured him that help was on the way. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood, and James felt both relief and apprehension. A police car and an ambulance pulled up, and officers approached him for more information. James recounted everything: the overflowing mailbox, the disheveled yard, Mrs. Whitaker's alarming appearance, and the state of her home. The officers nodded, their expressions serious. Before approaching the door, when their knocks went unanswered, they made the decision to force entry. The sound of the door splintering as they broke it open echoed through the street, drawing curious neighbors out of their homes. The next moments were a blur. Paramedics rushed into the house, their voices urgent. Through the open door, James could see them lifting Mrs. Whitaker onto a stretcher, her frail body now hooked to 4 lines. She looked even smaller and more vulnerable than before, her face pale but peaceful, as if she'd finally surrendered to the care she so desperately needed. One of the officers approached James. "You did the right thing," he said firmly. "She's in bad shape, malnourished and dehydrated, but she's alive. Thanks to you." As the ambulance doors closed and sped away, James stood in silence, his emotions a swirl of relief, guilt, and sadness. He had trusted his instincts and acted, but the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. Mrs. Whitaker had always been a beacon of strength and grace in the neighborhood. Seeing her brought so low was a stark reminder of how easily people could slip through the cracks when no one was paying attention. James knew he had taken the first step in helping Mrs. Whitaker, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of her journey and his role in it. As the ambulance carrying Mrs. Whitaker disappeared down the street, James Carter stood on the curb, his heart heavy. The quiet neighborhood of Brookfield seemed eerily still, its tranquility at odds with the turmoil in his mind. Had he done enough? Had he waited too long? The image of Mrs. Whitaker, frail and vulnerable on the stretcher, lingered in his thoughts as he climbed back into his postal van. Instead of resuming his route, James made a detour. He drove directly to Mercy General Hospital, where the paramedics had told him Mrs. Whitaker would be taken. He parked in the visitor lot, his stomach knotted with anxiety, and made his way to the emergency department. It took some explaining and a little persistence, but the hospital staff eventually allowed him to stay in the waiting room while Mrs. Whitaker was treated. Hours passed in agonizing silence. James replayed every moment of his encounters with Mrs. Whitaker, questioning whether there had been earlier signs he'd missed. Could he have acted sooner? Guilt weighed heavily on him, but so did a growing determination. Whatever came next, he would see it through. Finally, a doctor approached him. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an air of calm authority. "Mr. Carter?" she asked. James stood quickly, his hands fidgeting nervously. "That's me. How is she?" The doctor gestured for him to sit. "Mrs. Whitaker is stable for now, but her condition is serious. She's severely dehydrated, malnourished, and in a weakened state. She's also battling advanced cancer, which requires immediate attention." James felt the breath leave his lungs. "Cancer," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The doctor nodded. "From what we've gathered, she was discharged from a previous hospital stay, but didn't receive the home care she needed. It's not uncommon for elderly patients without strong support networks to fall through the cracks of the system." The word stung. The thought of Mrs. Whitaker, proud and independent, struggling alone, was almost unbearable. "Can I see her?" James asked. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "She's heavily sedated, but a familiar presence might be comforting when she wakes. Follow me." James trailed behind the doctor, his heart pounding. The sight that greeted him in the dimly lit hospital room was a far cry from the vibrant woman he remembered. Tubes and monitors surrounded Mrs. Whitaker's frail body, her silver hair spread across the pillow like a halo. James approached her bedside and gently took her hand, his rough fingers brushing against her papery skin. "You're safe now, Mrs. Whitaker," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not alone anymore." The hours ticked by as James sat vigil by her side, as dawn began to break, casting soft golden light into the room. Mrs. Whitaker stirred, her eyelids fluttered open, and her gaze landed on James. "James," she rasped, her voice barely audible. "It's me," he said, leaning closer. "You're in the hospital. They're taking care of you." Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't want anyone to see me like this, she murmured. I was so ashamed. James squeezed her hand gently. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You've always been there for everyone in the neighborhood. Now it's our turn to be here for you. Over the next hour, Mrs. Whitaker shared her story in halting, tired breaths. She explained how she had been discharged from the hospital due to insurance limitations and was told a home care nurse would visit. But no one came, too proud to ask for help. She tried to manage on her own, her health deteriorating with each passing day. I didn't want to be a burden, she said, her voice breaking. You're not a burden, James said firmly. No one deserves to go through this alone. In the days that followed, James rallied the community. He spoke to neighbors, sharing Mrs. Whitaker's story and urging them to come together. To his surprise, many responded with enthusiasm. Meals were prepared, donations collected, and plans made to rotate visits to her home once she was discharged. The most significant breakthrough came during a community meeting at the local church. James stood before the crowd, his voice steady as he spoke of the importance of supporting one another. Mrs. Whitaker isn't just a neighbor, he said. She's part of who we are. If we can't look out for each other, what kind of community are we? The response was overwhelming. People volunteered their time, skills, and resources, ensuring Mrs. Whitaker would have everything she needed to recover. Local businesses even offered to cover some of her medical expenses. Moved by James's story of compassion and action. Back at Mercy General, Mrs. Whitaker's health gradually improved. The doctor informed James that while her journey would be challenging, there was hope. With the right treatment and care, she has a fighting chance, she said. When Mrs. Whitaker was finally discharged, she returned home to find her house transformed. The yard was pristine, the interior cleaned and organized, and a group of neighbors waiting to welcome her back. Overwhelmed with gratitude, she turned to James. You did all this? She asked, tears streaming down her face. Not just me, James said, smiling. We all did. You're not just my neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker. You're family. In the months that followed, Mrs. Whitaker's recovery became a symbol of hope for Brookfield. The community grew closer, united by a shared sense of purpose. For James, the experience was transformative. He had always valued his role as a mailman, but now he understood the deeper impact of human connection. Mrs. Whitaker's gratitude was boundless, but James always brushed it off. You'd have done the same for me, he'd say with a grin. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, the profound power of love, empathy, and community to turn even the darkest moments into something beautiful. Together, they prove that no one is ever truly alone, not when kindness and compassion are just a knock away. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey. Mrs. Whitaker's story reminds us all of the importance of looking out for one another, even the smallest ways. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to Empathy Stories. Together, let's continue spreading kindness and creating a world where no one feels alone.